Hi, this is Max from the Bromberg Lab at Rutgers University, New Jersey, USA. I want to start with thanking the organizers for again giving us the opportunity to present our approach for the metagenomic geolocation challenge. Let me begin with a quick recap. Last year, some of you might remember, we were using our mi-faser annotation pipeline to transform metagenomic read samples into functional profiles. In those profiles, each sample is now represented by a vector of abundances of its enzymatic functionalities. Next, we use t-SNE to embed the high-dimensional profiles into a two-dimensional space, still retaining the distances between samples. And finally, we used clustering to separate the samples and group them into groups of the same origin. It turned out that this approach actually worked pretty well. On the left, you can see the t-SNE embedding of all known sample and colors and all mystery unknown samples in black. And on the right, you can see the clustering we proposed using dbScan, which is a density-based clustering algorithm. Finally, comparing our proposed clustering with the real mystery labels, we were actually able to perfectly recognize two of the cities, Oslo and Santiago de Chile, and the remaining cities we were still able to group 2 or 3 samples together each. Interestingly, those labels, those mystery samples which were labeled as outliers by dbScan, actually belonged all to Rio, which makes sense. It's a very diverse city and their samples were dispersed over the whole feature space. This year we aimed on improving this approach by first finding a better embedding, so avoiding losing information when we go from high dimensional to low dimensional space. We wanted to better detect batch effects and remove outliers in a data preprocessing step. We wanted to avoid any supervised parameter selection, and we wanted to finally predict the actual locations of those mystery samples. For the embedding, we used an approach called forest embedding in combination with UMAP. UMAP is simply a more efficient alternative to t-SNE. For the forest embedding, the first step is to train an extra tree classifier model, which is basically an ensemble of randomized decision trees. In the next step, the same data which we used to train the model, which is here all the known samples we had, we apply those samples again to this just trained model and extract the list of leaf indices per sample. So now each sample is represented by a list of leaves to which the sample is assigned when we apply it to the model. And finally, we use UMAP to embed this list of leaf indices into a two-dimensional space. Note that we use supervised UMAP here, so we also supply the classes of the samples. Thus, UMAP learns the best metric for embedding of these known samples. The metric we use here is Hamming distance, which is a metric which tells us if we have two lists of indices, in this case the leaf indices, if they are all the same, then the distance is 0. The more indices are different, the higher the distance between two samples. The challenge provided a total of 1,000 samples from 23 cities. Some of those had a second batch of samples which we did not include into the same city but treated as, so to say, different cities. First, we tried a pretty straightforward embedding just using UMAP and mi-faser in an unsupervised fashion, and we didn't really get a good separation of the known cities. When we added labels for a supervised embedding with UMAP, we got already a much better separation. But now come the forest embedding into play. The performance of the extra tree classifier we built is actually very different among the samples. So you can see for some of the samples, some of the cities, it's really high. For some of the cities, it's really low. But more interestingly, there are the second batches I mentioned. And for some of the cities, for both batches, we see the same performance. For others, we see a very different performance between the second and the first batch. And this already hints at clear batch effects we're going to see when we look at the data in more detail. So now if we use, instead of UMAP and the mi-faser functional profiles, the leaf indices we extract using this forest embedding approach, and we do UMAP with the leaf indices, we get already a much better separation. And finally, if we use UMAP and supervised with the leaf indices and the forest embeddings, then we get a really good separation of our known cities and use this as base to detect outliers and to recognize batch effects in our data. As I just mentioned, in the data processing, we now use this embedding to detect batch effects and remove outliers. And the way we do it is we use HDB scan, which is an improved approach to DB scan, with the difference that the density parameter epsilon has not to be set manually, but is set automatically. So we have our unsupervised approach here. And we remove, first of all, outliers, and we remove smaller clusters with less than 3 instances. To give you an example how this looks, if you look at Tokyo here, at the first batch, we see 2 outliers on the top left and on the top right in gray, which we remove, and we see 2 smaller clusters on the lower corner, very dense. If we look at the second batch of Tokyo, we see no outlier, but we see 2 larger clusters, and now it gets even more complicated. If we now try to combine the first and the second batch, we would actually find 3 different clusters. So this is one of the reasons why we did not combine different batches of cities, but treated them as basically an own city. But we clearly see strong batch effects here. We just have at the moment no means to really deal with them. However, we were able to remove clear outliers and smaller outlying clusters, and we can now use this filtered data set of the known samples to train a final extra tree classifier model, and then apply this model to create leaf indices for our mystery data, and then use these leaf indices with UMAP to generate the embedding of our mystery samples. Note that UMAP is this time unsupervised, not supervised as before with the labels, so we don't learn a metric, we just embed the mystery samples in their common small space. This brings me already to the results of our approach for this year's challenge. Here you see the embedding of the mystery samples in the 2-dimensional space as we propose it. And finally, we apply HDB scan on this embedding to separate the mystery samples into groups of mystery cities. This is a total of 7 clusters here. The 8th cluster would be implicitly the clusters, the samples which belong to the outliers as defined by HDB scan. When we now compare our proposed clustering with the reality, and we see unfortunately that we were not doing as good as last year. First of all, we got no city completely correct. We got some cities to a certain extent, so Krakow we got roughly 50% clustered into one cluster, but all the others are kind of intermixed, and also the outliers, which last year belonged to one city only, or mostly one city, are this year distributed amongst all the clusters. So of course the question was our approach just like worse, the wrong approach compared to last year's approach, which worked really well? So what we did is we went back and applied last year's approach to this year's data, and as you can see, the Tisney-based approach from last year does not really do better. And I did not try and go any further and do any more clustering here, because I think no clustering can fix that mess of colorful bubbles. So unfortunately, we could not reproduce the results we had last year. And of course, we thought about the reasons for this. And one thing we found is that the mystery samples this year were apparently quite different in their patterns or characteristic in comparison to the samples of the known cities. Second, we could show that there were strong batch effects in the data, not only between different batches of sampling, but also within one batch of a city. And not removing those batch effects clearly makes it more difficult to map new mystery samples to the structure of known, the structure found in known samples. And finally, we found that the approach of using UMED embedding in HTTP scan totally unsupervised not always resulted in reproducible results, which of course makes it difficult to figure out where the errors and the problems in the end with the clustering and the not segregating samples come from. However, we did not only try to group the mystery samples this year, we also wanted to actually predict the city which comes closest to them. And our approach here was we tried to predict city features. Those features were extracted from mainly Wikipedia and the Metasub website and included things like riders, so how many people would use the subway systems, the income of the city, the population, the latitude, amongst others. And we trained for each feature one random forest model on the set of all samples of the known cities. And then we used these models to predict those features for our set of mystery samples. And we tried to find a city which close matched those predictions for the mystery samples. In our first step, after training the model, we looked at the model performance, of course, and here you see the performance for 10-fold cross-validation, training on the entire set of known city samples, and in each round taking 33% of the samples out, which was distributed amongst all the cities. And you can see that, interestingly, things like riders and income and length of the subway were actually pretty well. Income was surprising for us. We now used the set of mystery samples and predicted those cities, those unknown cities. At this point, of course, we had the results, so we could compare our predictions of the model with the real features of those cities. And this is the performance for the prediction of the mystery samples. And you can see it's clearly not as good as in the cross-validation for the model, which we didn't expect. But interestingly, the best feature is income, which was really surprising to us. And we can definitely see that there is a signal. To a certain extent, can we use these features, some more than others, but we can use them to predict unknown samples in those characteristics. Finally, I want to show you a very early result of how we try to approach matching the actual cities based on those predictions for the mystery samples. And what we did here is we averaged over the difference of the predicted feature and the real feature for each of the samples. The more dark red prediction here is, the more likely it belongs to the predicted city, and black is actually a really good prediction. So in the end, apparently all of the cities seem to be close to Barcelona, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And Krakow seems to be the new New York, with basically having a piece of everything. This brings me to my final summary. We think that this last approach, the model really performs okay. However, there clearly needs to be some improvement made when it comes to the predictions. Mainly this bias towards Barcelona and Hong Kong suggests that we really have to find a better metric. And even though the whole feature prediction seems promising, we probably have to think about a better approach of doing this, maybe weighing the features differently, because clearly some of them, like income, were actually really predictive of the city. With this, I come to the end. Thanks for your attention, and I'm ready for your questions.